Hello, welcome to Gardener's World. Now, at this time of year, there's no question that the garden is beginning to slowly fade, but the jewel garden normally is rising to a kind of crescendo in September. And one of the dominant colours is orange. For example, we're beginning to get orange from the gingers, flowering very late, but they are coming through. But we're not getting the orange from tithonias. Now, tithonias are annuals, and by now, normally they're dotting all over the garden, but there are very few. The plants themselves are really healthy. They're growing strongly. Look at this one, full of leaf, really vigorous, and not a single flower on it. And that is because of the weather. This summer has been grey, damp, and rather chilly. And these are a plant that thrive in heat. So as gardeners, we have to take what we've got and make the most of it. But we also have to think ahead, and that's what I've been doing here in the grass borders. I think the grass borders are looking good by and large, but there are two huge miscanthus, these great clumps. They're an enormous grass, and in the right place, I think they look fantastic. But these two are in the wrong place. They've grown so big that they are out of proportion with the rest of the planting. So I'm going to move them further back. But the time to do that is not now. Move grasses in spring. But it is worth going around the garden at this time of year, making notes, planning for next year, whilst you've still got the growth to see, because you will forget, I promise you. Now, coming up on today's programme, Toby discovers how you can design a garden for wildlife.
This garden has so many layers and so many habitats. I mean, viewed from the house, it looks like a painting. You can ramp up the wildlife to 10 and get the wow factor.
We visit a singer-songwriter who uses her artistry to create a beautiful garden sanctuary.
I like the feeling of looking into something and it being like a sort of painting of a woodland or a jungle where you can't quite get the sense of depth.
Rachel visits a garden where the borders are refreshed and renewed throughout the seasons for a constantly dynamic display.
For me, the joy of visiting a garden like this is seeing these combinations of plants and thinking about how I could use those in my own garden and absorbing the atmosphere.
And I will be planting a topiary Ned. If this was June or even mid-July, I would be telling you that now is a really good time to plant out late-flowering annuals like these Nicotiana sylvestris. But here we are. It's September, and I haven't planted them. And in fact, I didn't sow them in time, and I bet that you, like me, every year have a tray of plants that are out of kilter with the season. But what I would suggest is plant them out nevertheless. Because if we get a mild autumn, they will flower in October and even into November. I've known Nicotiana sylvestris to be flowering at Christmas time. Now, Nicotiana sylvestris can grow 6 foot tall, topped by one of the most spectacular flowers in the garden. And the flowers give off a musky fragrance as dusk falls. I'm planting them a bit closer together than I normally would because they haven't got so long to grow, so they won't reach their full height. Now you can see that actually these plants are perfect for putting out. You can see the roots, but not too much. Nice healthy leaves, not too big, not too small, just the wrong time of year. I will thread the rest of these plants through these borders, and with any luck and a fair wind, I'll get to see those flowers and smell their fragrance before the first frost comes. Now, we're all very familiar at the moment with the importance of encouraging wildlife into our garden. And to have a garden that is as natural as possible is seen as a good thing, and I'm all for that. But there is one essential element that you need in a garden to make that work. And Toby has been to Sussex to see a really good example of it.
If you wanted to create your own eco-friendly wildlife garden, you'd be forgiven for thinking that you could just leave it to Mother Nature. However, that's not going to work, because in smaller spaces, what happens is one species tends to dominate, usually brambles that are hard to live with. No, in a more modest garden, what you need is another ingredient. You can ramp up the wildlife to 10 and get the wow factor, but you need good garden design. And in this garden, built around an eco-house near Rye, is where designer Christina Claude comes in.
Because the original house was being knocked down to make this new eco-home, there was a planning condition because there were bats in the house, and that any new landscaping that went in had to be good habitat for bats. So it had to have quite a few native plants or near-native plants, and planners were asking to reinstate the wildlife value in the garden. Bats, they just need the food source, really, and having water really helps with that, because obviously you get a lot of insects hanging around over water.
So with an eco-home, there's certain features, ground source heat pumps, water butts. Does that affect your garden design?
There was quite a few manholes and sort of aeration flues and all sorts of things in the ground to hide, and all in quite a close space together. How do you hide those features in a garden? And we came up with the idea of a wildflower meadow, and it was in a kind of orchard area, so a really nice thing. But if you can grow the really long grass, it's a really great way to hide all those kinds of covers and inspection chambers. We went for two different types of meadow. The one in the middle is a native wildflower meadow, which is quite a big height by the end of the summer. But the grass around it is a floristic turf, which has lots of different types of wildflowers that grow to not quite such a big height and are also able to be mown quite often. Problem with the wildflower meadow by a path is that it stands up really high, and it's great while it's dry, but then it rains and it all falls like this, so you can end up with really wet legs when you're walking.
And where do you picnic?
Yeah. I always try and do a mixed border kind of planting, so you've always got some shrubs in place as well. Some evergreen, some non-evergreen. All the perennials we leave up all the way through to the early spring before cutting anything back, so you've got the interest of the seed heads. So the garden sort of keeps rejuvenating itself. The wildflower meadow, again, that goes on right through to around about October. That's cut back, but there are spring bulbs in the meadow, so right from early spring, and there's cowslips and all sorts. Things start rising out of the ground quite early, and it's really exciting to see how it changes.
It reminds me of a Vivienne Westwood mohair throw, because it's just as fluffy and gorgeous. The stars of the show at this time of year are the umbels. This is yarrow, where it's loved by wildlife. And then, of course, there's the wild carrot. As the flowers go over, they turn into these lovely filigree balloons floating amongst the clouds of the opening flowers. And when you get your eye in and you look at the umbels, in the centre of each one is a little red flower. It's like a landing pad for the butterflies. This garden has so many layers and so many habitats. I mean, viewed from the house, it looks like a painting. It's got a foreground of a meadow, an open area in the centre, and vegetables and verbena inviting you to explore. In the centre of the garden, there's an open area. And when you get an open area, it creates a sun trap with an edge. And Christina has planted the edge up with some things that you might not think of in a wildlife garden, but they work beautifully. Miscanthus grasses, there's roses, these are fully double, but there are plants here for wildlife too. Now this is a cultivated cousin of the meadow cranesbill. It's called Geranium Azure Rush. Now, where the meadow crane's bill goes over because it's set seed, this is a sterile hybrid. And you might not think that's good for the bees, but they don't notice at all because it's still full of pollen, still full of nectar. But because it doesn't set, the flowers keep coming and keep coming right through to the frosts. There's herbs, there's beans, there's nasturtiums, and these are very clever because they're a decoy crop, drawing away the cabbage white butterflies from the kale. My favourites, though, in these raised veg beds, have got to be the artichokes. Now, as soon as they flower, well, the thing is, they're just so wonderful to touch. At the bottom of the garden is this beautiful, colourful bed. And it just goes to show that when it comes to planting for wildlife, you can forget the traditional concepts of a front and middle and back of a border. Mother Nature doesn't plant like that. She self-sows where she likes and puts skyscraping verbenas and evening primroses wherever. It's a cityscape for the bees. The thing that struck me was that Christina said that if you're going to have a wildlife garden in a small space, you need to start with the right recipe of plants. Ingredients like self-sowing fennel for summer, Californian poppies, mixed in with native plants like the achillea and the sea cabbage. I mean, there's even evergreens that, well, the spurge would be like a silver boulder when the rest of this goes down to ground in the winter. Sure, there's a little bit of editing. You've got to pull out plants that are taking over. But for the most part, this type of gardening is about sitting back and looking and enjoying the wildlife that visits the flowers. And that is my type of gardening.
I think it's a point worth repeating, that to encourage a garden to be as natural as possible, to have as wide and a diverse a range of wildlife, takes real horticultural care, management and skill. It's fascinating, but it's not about just letting it go. Now, in a vegetable garden, it's all about control, because you have to grow things on, you have to protect them, you have to weed them. It's a highly managed form of horticulture. And I've got some plants here that look a little bit weedy, a little bit insignificant, but I won't think about harvesting these before probably next May. This is a long-term investment. This is purple sprouting broccoli. I love purple sprouting broccoli. It seems one of the great treats of the year. Purple sprouting has a very limited season. Now, I've got a bed which I expect to harvest in early spring, and these are destined to be harvested as late as they possibly can, which will be May. Broccoli does get big. It'll grow at least 3-4 foot tall. They're heavy plants, and they get very top heavy, so they'll need support. So although they're tiny at this stage, you need to leave room for them to grow. So we can just plant these out about 3 foot apart. Like all brassica, broccoli do best on fairly rich soil. So if you've had a heavy crop before it, or you've got very light, free-draining soil, add lots of compost. Now, there's plenty of space here for intercropping. I could add some rocket, some winter lettuce, like winter density, Arctic king, which will grow quickly. And by using cloches and maybe some fleece, I can keep those going well into November. And that will be before the broccoli gets too big to crowd it out. Now, earlier this summer, we were sent a film by one of our younger viewers. It turned out to be hugely popular. He's clearly such a good gardener. So that's why we've gone back to see him again.
Hi, it's Logan again. This spring, I noticed that I wasn't doing so well with my anxieties due to a few little incidents that made them come back. But I'm still here, I'm still good, I've got over them by now, don't worry. And I went away for a week, leaving the beans that are about this tall, and now I've come back to see this jungle. And they've suddenly started growing massive. Tasty. Here, amazingly, we finally got some baby courgettes growing. We got rhubarb here that's doing really well. My pear tree, which is actually getting some decent sized pears on this year. More wannabeans like the ones at the beginning. Down here, I've got a little cucumber plant. That wasn't that big yesterday, was it? I mean, was it? Inspired by Monty, this year, as our experiment plant, we decided to try and grow cucamelons. 7 of the 8 rotted or got eaten before they even germinated. But one managed to survive, and now it's even got fruit on it. Just tiny, they're growing a lot better than we expected, but they're still surviving. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed the video. Goodbye!
Thanks for sharing your garden with us again, Logan. It's looking fantastic, and let's hope we get to see it again soon. The next month or so is maximum harvest for all top fruit. That's apples, pears, plums, and I would recommend that everybody should try and grow some. However, there are a few things to watch out for, and some of them can seem quite drastic. And we're going to start with a real horror story, because this is about as bad as it gets. This is a pear tree, and you can see that they are nearly all covered in brown rot. That's a fungal problem, but it's not caused entirely by the fungus. We've got an example here. You've got a hole at the stem end, and initially the hole is made either by an insect, it could be a bird pecking at it, and it could be microscopic, but it's just enough to let those spores in. It starts to rot. Invariably on the pears, it'll be at the stem and work down, and then at this time of year, completely full up with wasps. They love that rotting sweet fruit. In fact, I'm going to cut this tree down because it has become so bad, we're getting no fruit from it at all, so that's really sad. But mostly, you just get 1 or 2 on a plant. And if you see it, remove the afflicted fruit. Don't put them on the compost heap. Either bury them, the RHS says at least 1 foot deep, or put them out for the council to take away. And clear any that fall to the ground. But by and large, most trees will survive a few fruits getting brown rot and won't be as dramatic as that example. Now, I've got a problem here which looks like fungus, but actually isn't. And this is woolly aphid. You can see here on this apple the white, fluffy covering there. And if you look closely here, you can see tiny little grey aphids. And the white is a protective coating that they produce to put off predators. And the damage that they do is to the foliage, not the fruit. Now, by and large, there's not much you can do at this time of year. If it's really bad and it's really upsetting you, I would suggest the simplest thing to do is get a hose and spray it with water, and that physically knocks the aphids off and washes off the woolly coating. And that will do as much good as anything. The final part of this unholy trinity of fruiting problems can be seen here on these espalier pears, and it's canker. Now, canker is when you get a fungal problem that affects the wood of the plant. You can see very clearly that on these relatively young pears, you have smooth, healthy wood here. But where you've got canker, it gets all knobbly and warty, and what happens is you get these cracks that go in, and eventually it will kill the growth. And you can see in places here, it is dying back. Now, what you should do is cut back to healthy wood and then burn what you cut. Now, these are real problems, and they can become a big issue, but usually they don't. And particularly if you're growing top fruit, most trees, whether they are trained or whether they're allowed to grow free, can produce perfectly good fruit alongside having problems like woolly aphid or canker or scab. Look at the end result. If the fruit's good, then that's what matters. It's really important not to get hung up on problems in the garden. Gardening should be fun. It should be a creative act, whether you're making pictures or a mood or even a whole world. And that's certainly the case in the garden of Kyla LaGrange at her home in North London.
Ever since I was a child, I've loved fairy tales. I really like to create a sort of theatrical world. The garden is almost like a stage set for me, like you walk in and you just feel completely transported. It's like medicine being here, and I couldn't imagine not having this space. I'm Kyla LaGrange, and I'm a singer-songwriter and gardener. For most of my 20s and my early 30s, I was a performer and songwriter. You can be away from home a lot, or you can be stuck in a very small space for a long time. I think I discovered gardening at a time when I probably really needed it. Just having that space to come home to, I realised how much that kind of centred me. The garden's only 13 feet wide and 42 feet long, but I think it feels a lot bigger, and that's because the planting is so dense, and I've also tried to plant upwards as much as possible so that walls and fences are completely covered. I like the feeling of looking into something and it being like a sort of painting of a woodland or a jungle where you can't quite get the sense of depth. Your eye thinks things are bigger just because there are so many different levels of planting. This is the shady part of the garden, the woodland area, and over here I have sweet woodruff. It has these clouds of scented white flowers, probably one of my favourite woodland plants and great for softening edges and corners. This is a digitalis from the Illumination series. I really love how these spires have blooms around all sides rather than just one side. And you have this vivid pink tip going into a speckled creamy throat that I think is a really lovely contrast. And in this planting scheme, I love how the dried euphorbia heads are echoing the same colours in the digitalis, and I just think it works really well to tie it all together. So that's the woodland tranquil area, and as you step through these gates, you come into a totally different world. So this is a really different area to the woodland area at the back, and this area has a lot of hot tropical colours and quite dramatic shapes. I really wanted there to be almost like a picture frame, and then beyond you just get these layers upon layers of foliage and flowers. I really didn't want you to know how big the garden was so that you couldn't really get a sense of depth. And I think the banana and then the tree fern beyond create these focal points. You have one at the middle and one later, but you're not really sure what's going on in between. The other thing I've really tried to do here is to combine lots of different leaf textures. So a lot of the plants you see really contrast with each other in terms of texture and shape. It gives this sort of layered effect, like a sort of painting of a jungle. This is my sunniest border, and these are some of the key plants that really give this area its sort of colour palette. Starting with the echinacea in the foreground, and monarda, daylilies, helenium, and the ricinus, which I grow from seed every year. The rest are perennial, and they flower for such a long time. And I really love how these colours work together and sort of link into the rest of the garden. And so even though the echinacea is a pink, it has these really rich reds and oranges in the centre that I think tie it into the oranges and reds that you see here. If I were to choose a favourite from this sunny border, I think it would be the monarda. This is Jacob's Klein. I just love how bonkers they are. They look really eccentric. They're very alien-like, and bees just absolutely love them. They're great for pollinators. This section has a lot of things that I've grown from seed or from bulbs. Down here we have Antirrhinum, Potomac, dark orange, the cosmos, and this is Dahlia Hawaiian Sunrise. I really love it. I think it's such a beautiful shape. When it's grown in a slightly more shady spot, it's this sort of pale pink peach colour. But when it's grown in a slightly sunnier spot, you can see it's this more vivid pink and gold, which I really, really love. So after I'd been here for a couple of years, I'd completely filled up the garden downstairs. And I realised I really wanted to grow my own food. So I thought the only place I have to go is up. I have a grapevine, I have tomatoes, I have sweet corn, I have physalis, and they all do really, really well. You look down and you can see the whole garden before you, and it's just a really lovely view. The garden means everything to me. I'm quite an anxious person, and I often find it quite hard to just sit down or find that sort of stillness and peace. I've tried meditation, I've tried mindfulness, tried therapy, but nothing gives me that sense of calm like being out here. Time doesn't really matter when you're out here. It's almost like one of the few times I just feel completely still. There's no other time that I feel that sense of equilibrium than when I'm in the garden, and that's really precious to me. I hope that's something I keep with me for my whole life.
I really like the way that Kyla has created a garden so full of ideas, not just plants, but feelings and moods in what is really quite a limited space. This time of year, one of the things that gives me huge pleasure here at Longmeadow is the emptiness that is created by cutting the hedges and cutting the grass. And on the cricket pitch, which from spring through to midsummer is really busy with bulbs and wild flowers and long grass and the hedges growing, suddenly it's all cleaned away. And you have this clean, sharp space, and it's all about volume and void. And that can be beautiful too. Now, still to come on today's programme. Rachel visits Stockcross House Garden, where the head gardener refreshes and renews the borders throughout the seasons to create a constantly dynamic display.
How many plants are you taking out of here to make room for these plants?
Probably on this place, I took out 3 or 4 wheelbarrows of plants.
Wow, it's a lot.
Yeah, it is.
And we visit a gardener who's created an exotic paradise in his Yorkshire garden.
Initially, as you walk into the back garden, the first thing you see is like a wall of foliage and flowers. We've got really tall cannas that are up to 3 meters tall. We've got the tall bamboos, and then a bit lower level, we've got really colourful foliage plants like the irisine and the dahlias.
But first, it's time to visit another of your gardens.
I'm Larry, I'm 82, and I'd like to invite you into my garden off the green path. I built the fence. It's not rocket science. Come on in. I've been here 10 months. There was nothing here at all. So this is what it looked like when I first arrived. But I wanted vegetables. I imagined how I would grow vegetables here. And I thought, terraces. So I worked out how to build the terraces, and on we went. Purple beans, potatoes, peas, broad beans, courgettes, squash, onions, turnip beans, kale, flowers, lettuce. This is the neighbour's wall, and it could be all gloom and doom through the winter months. So out came the paintbrush, popped the posts in, wired it up, and dreamt of wonderful climbers. It's not doing too badly. You know, it's the peace and the beauty. And I think I might make it to 83.
I tell you what, Hilary, if ever there was an advertisement for the beneficial effects of gardening, you are living proof of it. Now, I'm preparing the ground to plant topiary Ned. I've got topiary Nigel, and topiary Nell is still very embryonic, but what I've learned from those two is that they are actually in the wrong position because they are orientated east to west, which means that the sun hits one side of them. Half of them are in shade almost all day long, and if you want topiary to be really thick and dense, then it does need as much sunshine as you can get. So by orientating Ned this way, and I'm looking into the sun, looking south, he will get sun for most of the day on most of his body. And I'm using yew, which tends to make the best topiary, but you can use lots of things, any kind of evergreen. And now is a really good time to be planting evergreens, even if you're not using it for topiary. But with yew, the most important thing is to make sure there's good drainage. So I've dug that over well, and I've got some grit that I'm going to add. This is horticultural grit, by far the best thing you can have for improving drainage. I'll just rake that over. These are all yew plants that I took as cuttings, probably about 5-6 years ago. I'm thinking that that main stem has the potential to be a leg. If I put that there, that could be another leg. Now this doesn't look very promising, but if I tie that in that way, and that one comes forward, we have the basis for the body. And when you bend any leading branch horizontally, it's going to slow down the growth of the leading shoot, but dramatically increase the growth of these side shoots. And the thing to remember when you're training anything is that all growth wants to be vertical. So if I want body here, by making that horizontal, I will fill up this space with these side shoots. Okay, I think we have the basis there of 2 front legs. A head will emerge in here, and we're beginning to get some sort of shape. Now, let's just get these in the ground. So that can go in like that. The next thing I'll do is put in some canes and start tying in and then cutting off any growth that I don't need. And then you can do the training really over the winter or even early next spring, because there'll be no new growth now until next April or May. So there's plenty of time. And in the next few years, we should see a lovely topiary ned develop. Now, last September, Rachel went to Newbury to visit Stockcross Gardens, where the head gardener, Istvan Dudash, has created borders that are exceptionally dynamic.
There's something about a late summer garden that always lifts the spirits.
There are lots of ways to bring plenty of colour into your garden at this time of year. But perhaps the best starting point is to visit other gardens that look beautiful at the end of summer.
Stockcross House has 2 acres of huge mixed borders, a formal pond, kitchen garden, stumpery and water garden. In late summer, these borders are really singing, and the composer is Istvan Dudash. Inspired by the nature of his native Transylvania, he builds these incredible borders big.
Here we are standing next to a border, and
Yes.
there are enormous plants
Yes.
right here in the front.
Yes, because I really like to use high plants like the tobacco and like hyacinths, because you can feel it, and also the atmosphere will be better. And also for me, it is a queen. He's a king, like the king, because there's a big leaves, a very strong plant, and he's more soft, more
Yes.
soft. But also it's very important you can see through the plant.
Istvan trained as a textile engineer, and it really shows in his planting.
The flow of the different colour through, for me, it's beautiful, like
Yeah.
a piece of fabric.
Yeah, thank you very much. And also for me, the shape and the form is more important than the colors. It's true, we need the colors, because without colors is not a proper border. But for me, each plant is same important. For I look after. Sometimes I'm thinking I am father of the plants.
The father, the king, the queen.
Yes,
We have everything
For me,
here.
for me, it's like a big family.
And it's not just one border he fills, it's all of them.
I do love how you come round another corner and you just see another completely different planting combination. This is so beautiful.
This combination is a good exemplar how important is the shape and the form.
It really is clever. Upright green agastache sitting in a cloud of small flowered rudbeckia, with glorious Dahlia Jasudi Hercules blooming in the middle, and small Spanish flag standing proud behind. Crucially though, these borders aren't in their first peak. Back in the summer, they were equally packed and beautiful. So to make space, Istvan removes lots of the early flowerers.
How many plants are you taking out of here to make room for these plants?
Probably on this place, I took out 3 or 4 vivaros plants.
Wow, it's a lot.
Yeah, it is. I can extend the flowering time of the border.
Wow, definitely not low maintenance. But, I mean, it's worth it.
But if somebody loves the job, this is the hard maintenance. It not seems hard maintenance.
I can't help but admire his passion and energy. And tucked in the veg patch, it's clear where those early flowerers go for a holiday.
Well, this is where all the magic happens. It's the real engine room of the garden. And in order to make the space for all that late summer colour, Istvan lifts a lot of the herbaceous perennials that we would leave in all year round. So there are delphiniums, lupins, all sorts of things in here, and he lifts them, he divides them and then pots them up. I think it's a brilliant idea.
These are planted out when the late summer flowers like dahlias come in for the winter, and the results are stunning.
I've seen some marvellous pops of really strong colour here, things like this lovely golden helenium. But I also am drawn to these areas of softer colours. Now, that gold comes through into the Japanese anemone here, honouring Jobert, which is this lovely sort of open shape. Also, then, you get the cool blues and mauves, so Salvia amistad, fantastic for pollinators. But I think what makes this work so beautifully is the lovely soft transparency, the melding of the Verbena Bampton. Now, that's a very small, compact variety, unlike the great tall Verbena bonariensis. And the Gauro, those little white flowers just dancing around in the slightest breeze. And these are plants that you could use in really quite a small space and get this beautiful effect.
Apparently, the anemones are self-sown. Istvan just lets them free range, so they pop up throughout this magnificent garden.
Of course, the late summer colour here is on a grand scale. But for me, the joy of visiting a garden like this is seeing these combinations of plants and thinking about how I could use those in my own garden and absorbing the atmosphere.
The garden at Stockcross House is open under the National Garden Scheme until the end of September, and that's by arrangement. And of course, there are lots of other gardens open, and it's a brilliant way with the National Garden Scheme to get inspiration for your own garden. And if you go to our website, you can get all the details. Now, it's pouring with rain. It wasn't forecast, but it's hammering down. And this is where the potting shed comes into its own. And I have 2 bays. This, which is for seed compost, and the other one, which is for potting on, potting up, or even if I'm doing a permanent arrangement in pots. And they have very different mixtures, and I thought this might be an opportunity to explain really what the mixtures are, because the base is a coir-based compost that we buy in. But I have to say, I hardly ever use neat compost like this. I always customize it. We've got perlite. And the beauty of perlite is that it improves drainage and retains moisture. And it's very good for more permanent planting. Vermiculite is a similar thing, but it biodegrades more quickly. So we use this with the seed compost, and we use the perlite with the potting compost. Grit is another element we use a great deal of. Horticultural grit is fantastic stuff. It has obviously no nutrition at all. and doesn't retain any water, unlike these two, but it's very good for drainage. So if you've got Mediterranean plants, cuttings, anything you want to improve the drainage of, grit is ideal. It's very good for dressing the top of a pot. This is one of the most important elements. This is sieved garden compost. And it's not just that it forms a really good growing medium and has nutrition, but also it contains bacteria and fungi, and that's really important for a symbiotic relationship with the roots of growing plants. And finally, soil. We always add a cupful or a handful of soil to each mix, and that is solely to introduce bacteria and fungi of the place, so that when we have plants that are going to be planted out into the garden, they already have a relationship with the very particular ecosystem, the biome that lives in our ground. Of course, you can use compost straight out of the bag, and most people do, and mostly with perfectly fine results. But if you really want to get the best out of your plants, if you want to adapt to their particular needs, then just think about customizing the compost or seed mixes you use. Now, we're going to Wakefield to visit the garden that has been created according to the particular passions of its gardener.
I'm a proud Yorkshireman and I enjoy the Yorkshire countryside, but I like the contrast of having something unusual in my own back garden. So I wanted to sort of create a mixture of exotic and tropical and Mediterranean style plants, all the sorts of exotic areas that you might get around the world. My day job is actually running the tourist information office locally and the art gallery shop, and this is my passion and my hobby. My name's Christopher Swain, also known as Yorkshire Chris, and I grow exotic plants pushing the boundaries here in Yorkshire. Moved in 9 years ago, and it was basically a flat lawn, and we cleared everything pretty much straight away, so we had a blank canvas to work with. And then I set about sort of doing a plan of how I wanted the garden to eventually look, and it was sort of a 5-year plan. I started with a big Jabea palm, and that was in quite a big pot, and that was positioned right in the centre. And then I built my paths around that area and measured it out so that I had nice sort of geometric shapes in this part of the garden. I'm not a trained garden designer. In this garden, everything I've created myself. I've built all the paths and built all the structures in the garden. Initially, as you walk into the back garden, the first thing you see is like a wall of foliage and flowers. We've got really tall canners that are up to 3 metres tall. We've got the tall bamboos, and then a bit lower level, we've got really colourful foliage plants like the irisine and the dahlias. And then we go through the winding wood chip paths and we move to an area where the jungle hut is. So this part of the garden is where I grow my tallest grasses, and it envelops the space. So I've got the large Miscanthus giganteus grass, and I've got the zebra grass as well to give that contrast. So when you're sitting in the jungle hut, you have a nice backdrop. As the summer progresses, everything gets taller and taller, and it makes it more interesting and fun to walk around. You go over a nice bridge where there's a stream, and then we move into a more open area, so it does open up so I can grow the more Mediterranean style, more arid style plants. So the second half of my garden, I wanted to increase the drainage so I can grow a wider range of tropical plants. So what I've done is used railway sleepers and decking to actually raise everything higher than the original ground level so that I can incorporate more soil and grit to fill the raised beds so that I can grow these plants. Further on into the garden, it does envelop you again. So we've got the big bamboos and palm trees, and I've got my tree ferns in the corner as well. We've got children from 3 to 15, and they love it. And I think when you're small, everything feels big anyway. And with everything being truly big in this garden, it must feel enormous. So it's like a full adventure, especially for my little girl, to actually go through the garden. It's like a day out just getting to the bottom of the garden.
It's really good because it's like not many other gardens are like it, and you can play hide and seek in it 'cause it's got loads of good hiding spots.
This is Chimerops humilis vulcano, Agave americana, Agave montana, Briar armata. I've got a really rare one behind, that's Trachycarpus aureophilus. I like to collect quite interesting and rare plants, so I do have all the different Trachycarpus species, and I like to collect all the sort of different gingers and cannas as well. I like colour in the garden, and I think Spanish flag is my favourite climate. I grow that from seed every year. I plant it out up some structures, but also at the base of bamboos and other foliage plants so it can grow up, and then it has these wonderful flowers that go from red to orange to yellow to white. Amaranthus is one of my also favourite sort of colourful annuals. They've just self-seeded around the garden, and I just leave them to get on with it, really. I grow Amicia zygomeris from Mexico. It's a tender shrub, but I found it hardy enough to grow for the last 10, 15 years. We have sort of indentations on each leaf, and then on the stems we have these sort of purpley green appendages, that I call them, and they look very unusual, and it's most asked for plant in my garden. When people come round, they stop at that plant and say, "What's that?" I grow a chocolate vine mainly for the scent in spring, which just smell of chocolate and vanilla. I grow that over the archway in the garden. If you've got two different types of chocolate vine, so I've got a cream and the purple type, they can cross-pollinate and you get the most unusual blue-purple sausage-like fruit. But it does taste like ice cream. Some plants are fine all year round in the ground, need absolutely no protection, whereas others do need a helping hand to get through winters. So my agaves, I like to put a clear plastic sheet over the top just to stop the rain and the snow and ice getting into the crowns of them. My bananas, I've got the hardy Musa baju, which I like to protect with straw around the stems. And then my more rarer onset Haniba bananas, I do have to dig up and bring them frost-free into the greenhouse. The soil's really important, and I think spending time and effort and a bit of money to getting the soil right in the first place will pay dividends in the long run, because you can get the drainage right, you can get the nutrient levels really good, and that will make the plants grow bigger and healthier. My family just let me get on with growing the garden and creating sort of a tropical paradise for them to be in the summer months. We'll never leave this garden now. I think this is our forever house and forever garden, and we're hoping that the plants will get bigger and better as the years pass by.
The garden looks fantastic, and the fact that it's in Yorkshire, which normally one thinks of as being inhospitable to that kind of planting, shows that actually where there's a will, there is a way, and it does look superb. This is the leaf mould bay, and every autumn, between October and Christmas, we systematically gather up every single leaf we possibly can, and they're all brought into here. So by Christmas, this is practically full. This is heaped up. And you can see it's reduced down, and we've done nothing. The difference between leaf mould and compost is that it decomposes almost entirely through fungal action rather than bacterial. So you don't have to turn it. You don't have to add oxygen. What you do need is water, which is why it's a fairly big area. And if it's wet, then the fungus can work. And what you end up with is a lovely material. And you can see that if I dig into this like that, if I get it up there, that is absolutely ideal added to a potting mix for plants like lilies or any woodland plants. And if you use it as a mulch, it improves the soil texture. But what we do is sieve quite a lot of it. So it goes into a sieve like this. And then, by sieving it, we break it down and bag it up, and then gradually throughout the season add it as part of our potting compost. And it's really good stuff. Don't say you don't have fun watching Gardener's World. And it doesn't matter what you use as a sieve. You can buy horticultural sieves. With this, you can get through a lot more quicker. And what you don't sieve, use it as a mulch in autumn. That clears it out, ready for the next batch of leaves to come in October. Right, well, while I'm doing some sieving, here's some jobs for you this weekend. If you still have tulips in containers from this spring, now is the time to empty them all out. Sieve out the soil and then choose the largest bulbs, which are good for planting into long grass. It's not worth keeping the smaller bulbs, so throw those away. And it's also a reminder that now is the time to order fresh bulbs for next year's containers. Now is a good time to take cuttings from Verbena bonariensis. Look for fresh shoots without flowering buds, and very often the best ones are to be had from side shoots between the main stem and leaves. Cut them cleanly beneath a node and remove any excess foliage. Place the cuttings into a free-draining compost, water them, and then cover them with a polythene bag. Put them somewhere warm to root, and they can be stored over winter to give you a fresh supply next spring. If you've been taking cuttings this summer, don't just leave them in the pot. But like these sage cuttings, once they've rooted, lift them, carefully separate them, then pot them on individually. They can then grow into strong plants ready to plant out either later this autumn or next spring. There is a tendency, and I'm prey to it too, of feeling at this time of year that somehow the year is fading gracefully away, that the light is getting thinner and the colours are getting softer. But actually, the garden still has a lot of energy left. There is still colour, there is still light, there is still energy and vibrancy. And I would say hang on to that by simple garden jobs. Deadhead. Take out all dead growth as you see it. Celebrate the colour that is still there in the garden, because there's going to be time enough to celebrate autumn when it really kicks in. But just for the moment, let's keep the garden fully and gloriously alive. That's it for this week. I'll see you back here at Longmeadow at 8 o'clock next Friday. So until then, bye-bye.